Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. It's 2:45 on a Tuesday here in New Orleans, the last day of March, and we'll just jump right into it. Today we're going to continue with our talk of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and move forward from there. And as soon as that act was signed into law, Kansas became testing grounds for the fate of slavery in the United States. So Kansas became a frontier in two ways you can think of this. As a region at the edge of the settled areas of the United States, but also a conceptual space on the edge of national precipice. So in one way or another, Kansas would show the nation if slavery could be peaceably negotiated. I want to share the screen here. Should have done that earlier. And let's do that. And you there we are. That's the name of today's lecture, the Irrepressible Conflict. And why isn't that working? There we go. This pamphlet that you see on my left capitalizes in this westward pull we've been talking about. Not just some manifest destiny, but largely the religious, the political meanings of that Kansas symbolized. These lyrics are written by this prominent Quaker poet, John Greenleaf Whittier. These pamphlets were sold, they were given away in the years following the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and I'll read a few of the stanzas. We crossed the prairies of old, the pilgrims crossed the sea to make the West as they the East, the homestead of the free. So clearly he is linking people moving west in the same motivation, the same boat, terrible pun, as pilgrims, as early Puritans. We go to rear a wall of men on freedom's southern line and plant beside the cotton tree the rugged northern pine. So what I get from that is that out in the West, they're going to take the best of both worlds. They're going to take what things that grow in the North and things that grow in the South and move them to a whole new place, the West. Finally, a bearing like the ark of old, the Bible in our van. The van is like a carriage or something like that. We go to test the truth of God against the fraud of man. So the second image, though, is a certificate of donation given to Northern supporters of Kansas immigration. There were several organizations that developed just to raise money for the free citizens of Kansas and ensure the establishment of freedom in the territory. And that territory soon housed a diverse set of people as existed across the United States. New England immigrants, people that were very opposed to the expansion of slavery. They often lived in these ramshackle towns and frontier communities. They sought their fortunes while fighting off slave power. These were free soilers that we've spoken about before. On the other side were the southern settlers moving over there. Very few with slaves, but having moved to Kansas to vote for slavery. Here's an idea of what they could have been living in. The real problem in terms of fomenting what would become a quasi-civil war were Missourians. These Missourians flooded the borders, armed often on these drunken voting expeditions. As one settler in Kansas described it, Kansas was all drunkenness, riot, and violence. One free soiler from Massachusetts highlighted the absurdity of the tension because the goal, as he saw it, was for the, quote, great Anglo-Saxon race to take possession of Kansas. And this is a strange point. These New Englanders wanted more than freedom in Kansas. They wanted a state that remained white. So when they said no slavery, they meant no black people. Even in 1854, these settlers saw the battle as a violent contest for white, not black, or universal political rights. Peculiarities of that contest would prove extremely volatile when things turned violent. Kansas clearly is a powder keg that is waiting to be lit. By March of 1855, just 11 months after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Kansas held its first election for a territorial legislature, first step towards achieving statehood. Over 5,000, we'll call them border ruffians, mostly Missourians, but also other Southern pro-slavery sympathizers, spilled into Kansas to stuff ballots. The earliest Kansas census put the population at 2,905 eligible voters in this entire territory, but 6,307 people managed to vote in this election. These numbers are a little off, as you can see. As early settler described, quote, any citizen of the U.S. by paying $1 poll tax may vote in Kansas. In Kansas, well, I keep saying Kansas because I've been working on Kansas earlier, I guess. But a person goes to jail for saying that slavery is illegal. For freedom of speech, we have imprisonment, he declared, and for giving liberty the oppressed, death. Is this America, the land of freedom? So here's an idea. In March of '56, the fiercely anti-slavery Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner delivered a speech in the U.S. Senate. Sumner was an anomaly, one of a handful of true abolitionists who held an elective office. Sumner fit the stereotype of a Massachusetts politician, high-minded intellectual. He was elected in the Bay State largely because of anti-Mexican War sentiment that he held. At first, his fellow senators used parliamentary procedure to block Sumner from speaking. The truth was that anti-slavery speeches were not welcome in the halls of government at that time. But by '56, Sumner had gained enough experience and clout to raise his voice, and he made his voice heard one day. His speech, "The Crime Against Kansas," not only described this vast conspiracy that the slave states were taking hold of the government, but made a dire warning about the future. The strife is no longer local, but national, Sumner warned. Even now, while I speak, portents hang on all the arches of the horizon, threatening to darken the broad land, which already yawns with the mutterings of civil war. Unfortunately, Sumner also used the speech to make personal attacks on certain Southern slaveholding politicians. Beyond calling slavery, quote, a mockery of the great fathers of the Republic, already a serious offense for honor-bound Southerners, Sumner described Senator Butler of South Carolina cavorting with the harlot slavery. There's some more. That's Andrew Butler right there. He has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows. Slavery. Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, South Carolina congressman, took it upon himself to defend his uncle's honor. And on May the 22nd of 1856, with the protection of his partner there, Lawrence Keat, Brooks beat Sumner within about an inch of his life with a thick wooden cane. Beating was so severe that Sumner, who was sitting at his desk, which was bolted to the ground, while trying to get away, he ripped his desk up from the Senate floor. Here are some portrayals of it. See Keat over here, and the other senators away. This one you've already seen, and it took Sumner years to recover completely. Brooks, though, became a hero across the South, where commemorative canes were sold, and they sold very well. Back in Kansas, there was this aged man, born in Connecticut, failed in multiple business ventures, 55 years old at the time, which was rather elderly at that time of day. He had joined his sons on a rabid abolitionist settlement called Osawatomie. Not even having heard about Sumner's beating, this man, John Brown, wanted to respond to the pro-slavery outrages in the territory of Kansas. And late one night, March 24th, Brown led a small group to the houses of 5 pro-slavery settlers near Potawatomi, Kansas. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name of that town, Kansas. The men were dragged outside their homes, along with the wives screaming and children screaming. Men were dragged out, beaten, hacked apart with swords, and riddled with bullets. The brutal butchering of these men, though, made Brown a celebrity. He was infamous as well as famous for his galvanizing role in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas. That's worth remembering and writing down. Brown soon had to leave Kansas, though, at the threat of violence and arrest. In his mind, he was re-energized with his anti-slavery dreams. He sought to capitalize on his newfound infamy. Tours around the Northeast, Brown abundant, very much an opportunist who had this talent for manipulating his own symbolism and allowed him to embody abolitionism. He was the embodiment of it, in his mind at least. Parlors, churches, lecture halls, as he was newly minted now, Osawatomie Brown earned enthusiastic audiences. Thoreau and Emerson saw him speak, dozens of other notable New England personalities. In less than 2 years after this almost penniless person had moved to barren Kansas prairies, he was filling seats at these auditoriums and having to turn people away. The donors were giving him money, and he was convincing them of his own heroism. And remember, this guy, Brown, he had ordered the brutal murders of 5 pro-slavery supporters. He was now welcomed as a hero in the North. So this is a lens through which to understand how out of control, out of hand things are getting, the situation between North and South when you examine it through John Brown. Fundraising in New England, Brown specifically wanted to meet the still injured Charles Sumner. And he visited him at his home. Apparently Sumner was still limping quite badly. Brown talked to him for a while, but he requested to see the coat that Sumner was wearing when Brooks attacked him. And he still had the coat in his closet. He, got it out or something and handed it to him. And Brown said, quote, "It was still stiff with dried blood." And he apparently kind of held onto the coat and was like rubbing it on his face. And he vowed right then to avenge. Brown, as you're starting to figure out, was a bit of an oddball. So we have in Congress people being beaten, we have people being murdered in Kansas. And the issue of slavery is just poisoning one part of American society after another. Churches, denominations are being split. Some are still split today. Political parties ceased to exist. Congress itself is a battleground. The office of the presidency was not safe either. It was occupied by a succession of men, 3 of whom, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan, were essentially Southerners who happened to be from the North. They are what are called dough faces. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned a dough face before. At this time, only the Supreme Court had to not really address the slave question, but Americans took to the courts for answers for divisive issues. And 2 days after Buchanan took office, the court handed down the decision in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. The history of this case stretched back for several years. We won't go too deeply into it, but concerned an enslaved man who had taken up residence in a free state and sued for its freedom. And President Buchanan had hoped that this decision could settle things. But he urged the court to make ruling as broad as possible. Now, it was an instance of the executive branch tampering with the judicial branch. He hoped that the stature of the court would make people respect the decision. In the end, though, this case cost the court much credibility. So I should have pressed that a little bit earlier. So the court rendered a landmark decision in the Dred Scott case. They had for more than a century been regarded as being of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. So, there's two important elements in this ruling. Dred Scott is not a citizen. No African American can be a citizen. Also, Congress could not keep slavery out of the territories. Any plan, including popular sovereignty, that would block slavery was unconstitutional. Response to the decision was, as you can imagine, quite heated. Many in the North, and especially Republican Party, reacted angrily. There's a slave power conspiracy at work. Here's proof. Most of the South, as you can imagine, also applauded the decision. And the court emerged, though, tarnished. And we get back to Brown. Sorry, I have to did something. Sorry. And one reason to discuss John Brown is that I want to make sure you all understand the importance of these symbolic political movements in the build-up to secession. I've said that the Kansas-Nebraska Act had the greatest impact, but the most divisive symbolic act comes from John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in '59. Now in '57, Brown had returned to the East, began raising money, as we were just talking about, and he secured the backing of 6 prominent abolitionists known as the Secret Six, and he assembled this invasive force of people. His army, we'll call it, grew to include 22 men, including 5 black men and 3 of Brown's sons. And this group went to a Maryland farmhouse near Harper's Ferry and prepared for an assault in Virginia across the river. And on the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and his band overran this arsenal. Some of the men rounded up a handful of hostages, including a few enslaved people. Word of the red spread, and by morning time, Brown and his men were surrounded, though. And a company of U.S. Marines arrived on October 17th, and they were led by none other than Colonel Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant J.E.B. Stewart. And on the morning of October 19th, my birthday, the soldiers overran Brown and his followers. 10 of his men were killed. Brown was injured. 2 of Brown's sons were killed as well in this raid. And the wounded Brown was tried by the state of Virginia for treason and murder. He was found guilty on November the 2nd, and the 59-year-old Brown went to the gallows on December the 2nd of '59. And before his execution, he apparently had slipped his guard a letter that said, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." He was correct there. And although the raid failed, it inflamed sectional tensions and raised the stakes for the 1860 presidential election. Brown's raid helped make any further accommodation between North and South more or less impossible, and thus began an important impetus for the Civil War. And Brown is often referred to as the meteor of the war. And meteors, as you might know, like once upon a time, they like foretold, they're shooting across the sky, people that know, they're like foretold future events, whether good or bad, whatever. But also they burn out quickly. They kind of come in and they're gone. So that was what Brown was. He was a meteor in both sense. Finally, about Brown, shortly before his ill-fated raid, he met Frederick Douglass in Pennsylvania and explained his plan to Douglass. Brown, though, who wanted Douglass's support, did not receive it. Douglass even tried to change his mind, calling the plan a perfect steel trap and that he would never get out alive. Brown should have listened, clearly. One of the troops guarding the execution of Brown that day, though, was a Maryland man named John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor. Booth later claimed to have, quote, aided in the capture and execution of John Brown. This is not true. He simply purchased a counterfeit uniform in order to stand by and see Brown hung. Quote, "I was proud of my little share in that transaction," Booth falsely recalled, "for I deemed it my duty that I was helping our common country to perform an act of justice." He's kind of speaking to his own future here, perhaps, right? Booth reacted with disgust and, quote, "What was a crime in poor John Brown is now considered the greatest and only virtue of the whole Republican Party." Booth concluded that, quote, "abolitionists were the only traitors in the land." And among those gathered in Charlestown for Brown's execution were impassioned abolitionists. They carried copies of this poem by E.C. Stedman, a description described by a contemporary as scattered around the streets of Charlestown. Stedman's poem warned Governor Wise and the South about the consequences of taking revenge on Brown. But each drop from old Brown's life veins, like the red gore of the dragon, may spring up a vengeful fury, hissing through your slave-worn lands. And old Brown, Osawatomie Brown, may trouble you more than ever when you've nailed his coffin down. So it's declarations like these that make Harper's Ferry an extremely diversive and impactful moment, and a moment of sectional tension in our history. Here. There we go. Abraham Lincoln is campaigning for president when John Brown was captured. And he was forced to respond to Brown. There was no way around that, right? He wants to be president. He has to address this. And what was probably Lincoln's most famous speech before becoming president at Cooper Union in New York, he was there to give a speech designed to justify Republican positions and reassure the South that remaining united would unite all. Cooper Union Hall, February 27th, 1860, 1,500 New Yorkers were there, and Lincoln highlighted the 39 signers of the Constitution and noted that a majority believe that Congress should control the spread of slavery in the Western territories. Therefore, Lincoln explained to his audience that the Republican Party's platform was simply honoring the founding fathers, not antagonistic to the South. And in that speech, Lincoln, though, was forced to discuss John Brown. People are yelling about John Brown. People say that he was a Republican. And Lincoln called Brown a misguided fanatic for his willingness to give and take life for abolition. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was not a slave insurrection, Lincoln explained, but merely an attempt by white men to get up a revolt in which the states refused to participate. So he is saying not even enslaved people were interested in this guy. He is an anomaly. This is not representative of the Republican Party. Lincoln challenged his opponents not to clumsily make Brown a Republican just because he was opposed to slavery. So in doing so, Lincoln inadvertently spoke to Brown's symbolic power, though. "You charge that we stir up insurrections among your slaves," he said. "We deny it. And what is your proof? Harper's Ferry? John Brown?" And the political stakes are enormous, and Lincoln cannot echo New Englanders who celebrated Brown's ends and ignored his needs. So for this, Lincoln, even if he agreed with Brown's position on slavery, he could not excuse the violence and the bloodshed and the treason. "Who were our fathers that framed the Constitution?" Lincoln asked, reminding his audience that the founders were divided over slavery, but came together in the spirit of compromise. As Lincoln moved to present concerns, he tried to downplay the recent events of John Brown, the actions of John Brown. John Brown was no Republican, Lincoln tried to explain. Some of you admit that, but still insist that our doctrines and declarations necessarily lead to such results. We know we hold no doctrine and make no declaration which were not held to and made by our fathers who framed the government under which we live. Explaining away how Brown had flung slavery into the center of the 1860 election, Lincoln shifted the focus to political frustrations and legal intricacies. Wrong as we think slavery is, Lincoln maintained, again, compromise, we can yet afford to let it alone. And we want to keep Lincoln's pleas in mind. when we consider this mixture of explosive circumstances swirling around the end of the volatile 1850s and the election of 1860. So to review here, so the emergence of a one-issue party, Republicans are formed to restrict the spread of slavery. Therefore, their rhetoric can easily be interpreted by paranoid Southerners as proof positive that the Union is dead. The Republican Party is the abolitionist party. The Dred Scott decision. And not even the Supreme Court was immune from the influence and power of the slaveholding South. Paranoid Northerners now they had proof positive that the slave power conspiracy was real. John Brown's massacre in Bleeding, Kansas, and especially though his invasion of Harper's Ferry, it was a disaster for those who were hoping to tamp down paranoia. Reactions to Brown and his disregard for the nation's law was a terrible omen. And then the country found itself in an election year. 1860 presidential election was waged by 4 candidates on 4 different platforms. This is the most fateful presidential election in the history of the country. I would argue still today. Democrats had first met in April of 1860, just 4 months after April. It was clear quickly that the party was not going to be able to hold together. The party was fractured immediately. They met in just the worst place where they could meet, where? Charleston, ground zero, fire eater sentiment, and vigorous sectional feelings there. Stephen Douglas was the favorite of the northern wing of the Democratic Party, but he was unacceptable to the Southern fire eaters. He had spoken out against Dred Scott. Southerners wanted the center of the platform to be a guarantee for slavery in the territories. Douglas and company were still behind popular sovereignty, even though Dred Scott had made it unconstitutional. So it appeared, though, Douglas might win the endorsement, but when Northern Democrats mentioned popular sovereignty, the Southern Democrats walked out. Convention adjourned without settling on a candidate, and they agreed to reconvene in Baltimore that coming June. The Baltimore Convention nominated Douglas and affirmed popular sovereignty. Delegates from 11 Southern states, though, again, walked out, and they had their own convention. The Southern minority named John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, a former vice president under Buchanan. The platform called for explicit federal protection of slavery in the territories and for the annexation of Cuba. It was thought that Cuba itself could be divided into it could be one or divided into several different slave states, creating more power for the Southern slaveholding states. And the Republican Party met in Chicago and chose Abraham Lincoln. They were well aware the split of the Democratic Party was a great opportunity. And several principal contenders failed in early ballots. William Henry Seward, S-E-W-A-R-D, of New York, seemed to be the leading candidate, but he had been tainted, I guess, by this radical speech. He was called the Irrepressible Conflict speech. The convention decided to look to someone a little bit more moderate. They settled on Lincoln. Key in the election would lie in capturing the northern states that had contended Democratic. The Republican platform tried to cater to various segments of the northern population. And they wanted to keep slavery out of the territories. They said they would accept slavery where it existed. So again, they're not abolitionists. And they called for Transcontinental Railroad and Homestead Acts. Fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party. They just wanted to avoid slavery. Focus was entirely upon the Union and tried to run a campaign on principle of union. Hold the Constitution and keep the Union together. John Bell of Tennessee was their nominee. He was a former Whig and a slaveholder, a large slaveholder. And the platform ignored slavery, called for the support of the Constitution and of the Union. And the campaign offered the spectacle of a nation in trauma. Basically broke into 2 elections, really. Breckinridge versus Bell in the South, Douglas versus Lincoln in the North. Lincoln did not appear on most Southern ballots. Radical Southerners, those fire eaters, had already declared that the Republican victory would mean secession. Here we go, the results. All four candidates professed devotion to Union, of course, but in the end it was a completely sectional result. Lincoln carried every northern state except for New Jersey. Bell took Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Breckinridge took the remaining slave states. Lincoln, as you can see, easily won the Electoral College. Even if you combine the other nominees, he won. But Lincoln's opponents polled about 60% of the popular vote. He got around 40%. Lincoln was a minority president. He did not receive a single vote in 10 of the slave states, and apparently only John Quincy Adams entered the office with less support. The response was heated. As you can imagine, Southerners were not comforted. They're not comforted by the fact that Republicans gained control of neither House of Congress. They focus on the fact that a party with no support in the slave states now controlled the White House. Many Southerners considered the Republican triumph a threat to slavery. They pointed to the fact that many Republicans, Lincoln including, had cheered John Brown. I'm sorry, Lincoln not included. Lincoln not included, but many Republicans did support John Brown. And what was the Southern mindset, though? That Northerners, Republicans, etc., were devoted to destroying slavery and with the entire South, the Southern way of life, the plantation South, the white South that had controlled the presidency for so long. They were so opposed to the idea of a Northern president. And those who voted for Lincoln insisted that the South must abide by the verdict of the ballot box, just as people in the North had done for so many years. Many pointed out that the slave power had been running things in the United States for years and years. There were more people in the North, though, than in the South. We here have abided by the results of the elections, even though it didn't go the way that we necessarily wanted it to. It's time to, we played by the rules. Southerners are expected to do so now. Everyone knew, most everyone knew the month following the election was crucial to the nation. People watched the South, watched Southern states. What are they going to do? And secession began quickly. The lower South reacted decisively towards Lincoln's election. Beginning with South Carolina, 7 states left the Union between December 20th, 1860 and February 1st of 1861. A convention called by South Carolina legislature met in Charleston, and on December 20th, 1860, they voted to secede unanimously. It was over the next 6 weeks that 6 other states left the Union. The whole tier of southern states left, moving west to east: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida. In Texas, the Unionist governor, Sam Houston, opposed secession. He said it would be the greatest mistake that Texas ever made. He was right. And he was also removed from the governorship. So we're going to stop there today. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I will be speaking with you and seeing you very soon.